My name is Martin Peters. It's absolutely delight to be here in Zagreb, especially on this morning. And we went for a walk at 6 o'clock this morning, and the city was coming alive, and it has such an energy about it, Zagreb. So it's lovely to be here. And also very nice to see our colleagues from various parts of the world, a highly diverse population who are interested in the concept of visual cultures and visual pedagogies. So we also, as Tina said, we have an association now where this is the very first inaugural conference. Our thanks to the Dean, who has been extremely supportive and helping younger people and bringing the university into the 21st century. We've had video and film and television around for a long time, but this is really the first video journal that we've seen in the education humanities. So, that's a big moment for us, and I hope that you're going to join the association. You're going to become a strong part of this experiment to bring the university from the 11th century, let's say, the medieval university established in 1088 in Bologna, right? And now in the 21st century, finally we're coming to acknowledge the importance of visual culture, and also the concept of video. So it's taken a little while, and we might say that this is the future of a form of scientific communication. And when I was discussing, let me just tell you this, when I was discussing this with the Springer people, if I can start with just a small anecdote here, because we had this idea, I've been discussing this idea with a few people, and I know the CEOs of many of the major publishing companies, and I went around with a proposal and circulated this to people in academic publishing. And most of them that I circulated the proposal to said, yes, it's a good idea, but we don't have the technical capacity to do it. I said, oh, really? And then one day I went to see somebody called Nick Melchior, who can't be here today, who would have liked to have been here. He's a New Zealander who's the Australian CEO for Springer. And he said, Michael, he said, that's the best idea that's come across my desk in 10 years. I said, well, hold on, this is it's not really rocket science. It's quite a simple idea. But he then discussed it with his boss, Harman, who's in Singapore, and Harman discussed it with his European boss, and it took 3 months, and eventually they came back and they said, I'm sorry, we don't have the technical capacity to do this. These are billion-dollar entities, publishing companies, and they didn't have the technical capacity. So it was quite an interesting story about innovation. How innovative are the big publishers, and what is the motivation for them to experiment? So this is where the Learning Society comes in. We are hoping to push them to accept all sorts of new challenges in the age of visual culture. At that point, I decided that we should really talk to a few institutions, and the people who you were introduced to here from this morning as part of the executive, member institutions, all of whom contributed a substantial stake in the journal. So this is the Video Journal of Education Pedagogy, and each of those foundation institutions, now we're climbing, I think we're 8 or 9, put a considerable amount of money in the pot. And I went back to Springer and I said, look, we have $80,000 in the pool here, does that make any difference? They said, oh no, it's a matter of principle, Michael. No, of course not. But I will go back to talk to the European boss, and they went away for 2 or 3 days. They came back and they said, we've discovered that we could do this. They suddenly discovered that they had the technical capacity. So there was one other journal there. It was a journal in medicine, And I understood when I was talking to the boss there, let's say you have you're investigating the aneurysm in an aorta, and you're looking at new surgical techniques. Do you want to read the latest scientific paper on it? Or do you want to actually see a demonstration of the latest surgical technique? Now, there are many disciplines that fit into that kind of category. Practically oriented disciplines in the area of visual arts, let me say performance, any discipline that has a practical application where to see something happen rather than to read about it makes good sense. So today in my presentation, which is with my co-editor Jayne White, I'm going to really be looking at the history of the journal and the way in which we are making it finally into the age of visual culture through this journal. So I want to go back to the first journal in continuous production, which is the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. This was a journal, the first real journal in continuous production, established in 1666. There was one editor, Henry Oldenburg. This is actually the frontispiece from Thomas Spratt's History of the Royal Society. And from the National Portrait Gallery, what we see here is the one journal editor who made the report. So this is the first journal here, a written text, a report by one person, and there were many different kinds of episodes that made on this journal. So you had a record of the observation of the transit of Venus. So you had some astrological, pieces in there. We had various medical reports. You had, of course, chemistry and the basic physics that made up this. And I should say here also in this frontispiece here from Thomas Spratt, you have also part of the inspiration that gives you the ideology behind the Royal Society. So you've got three figures there. You see William Bruckner, King Charles, and Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon being really the inspiration behind the Royal Society. And here's a copy of the first journal, the frontispiece here, the Philosophical Transactions, and you can see the first volume there, volume 1, 1665. So if I just try to deconstruct that visual image there, the bust of Charles II, which is the Society's, first, let me go back here for a moment. The bust of Charles II, who was the first patron. And then you have Viscount Bruckner, Francis Bacon, located to the right, and you see that this whole enterprise, the scientific enterprise, is remarkably short. We're only talking a few centuries here, which is, I think, quite extraordinary. So, and what we saw here, you see, at the beginning of this is his remark in this first journal. How he says, "How few secrets have there been that have been long concealed from the whole world by their authors. There is no question at all, but all of the greatest part of them will soon flow into this public treasure." So one gets here, behind this scientific enterprise, emerging things about openness and the publicness of knowledge. So critically important to the scientific community. Openness and secrecy, concepts around knowledge production. Knowledge is property, intellectual property. Also around this time, the whole intellectual and legal infrastructure to do with copyright and patents, which came into effect during this period of time. And we must see that this 1666, we're talking a couple of centuries later from the development of the printing press, the movement from the letterpress to movable type in a few decades, the first kind of globalization of knowledge leading to the systematic circulation of ideas. I think it's important to preface comments about the rise of visual culture with the kinds of technological developments that took place in printing and how important that was for the circulation, the circulation of knowledge and for the exchange of knowledge from scholars, which actually took the form before printing press of letters to one another, scientific letters. But, so that notion of knowledge exchange was there pretty well early on. And we come to today, this is a visual representation, a network of scientific knowledge obtained from the data traffic of scientific journals. That was a few years ago now. You can see here we're representing the different disciplines and the transactions between them, and the way in which now there is a huge accent also on the visualization of data. So, one of the technical problems that face the intellectual community is not only knowledge exchanges across different disciplines, but also how one copes with the tremendous saturation of knowledge, of data, of open data that comes to us in a continual stream. How do we organise it? How do we archive it? How do we preserve it? And also how now we can make it accessible to a larger public. I also want to draw attention to the way in which the shift from printing, from a culture of print to visual culture takes place and what its effects are on the academy. I'm going to a paper by Jonathan Bella in 2003 where he talks about a mode of production. So we might talk, he says, a cinematic mode of production. And he's talking about it in terms of a kind of political economy to chart the shift from the culture of print to the visual culture. And I think we might talk about a visual mode of production here. So let me just quote from him for a moment, because I think that Jonathan's paper provides us with some kind of clue as to where we might go in talking about the visual mode of production. He says then, and cinema has been around for a long time, much longer time than the visual journal. Cinema marks a profound shift, he says, in the relation between image and text. Indeed, is the watershed of the subjugation of language by image. Cinema, as an innovative shift in both industrial capitalism and cultural practice, marks, therefore, the restructuring of language, of a language function in accord with the changing protocols of techno-capitalism. And I think that one of the things that we have to do here, and one of the things I'm very keen on, and I know a lot of other people are, is to embrace a very wide philosophy of visual culture here. And in particular, the way in which that shift from print to image and the multiplicity of development here around representation has philosophical effects. I quote from a book that I was very influenced by in my graduate past, by the American pragmatist Richard Rorty, who wrote a book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. And very early on in that book, what he's talking about is the optional ocular metaphors that populate early Greek epistemology, and how that could very well have been otherwise, which begins to denaturalize the concept here. Let me read this just for a moment. I think it's a very interesting quotation. He says, in a historical epoch dominated by Greek ocular metaphors, may yield to one in which the philosophical vocabulary incorporating these metaphors seems quaint as the animistic vocabulary of pre-classical times. And I think that one of the things that he is talking about in this respect is if you move to a visual culture and to a visual mode of production within techno-capitalism, what does this mean for the academy? What does it mean for concepts that we take for granted? What does it mean for reading? What does digital reading really mean here? In relation to the old Augustinian model, and Peter and I have just finished a paper around working on this in the last little while. What does it mean for reading? What does it mean for writing? What does it mean for scientific communication? These questions, the Academy has been slow to answer. And so, it's incumbent on us as an intellectual community to begin to address these issues, I think, in philosophical ways and in quite systematic ways. I must say I've been very influenced by John Berger's early work on ways of seeing, on what he says here is the critique around publicity capitalism and how important it is to develop a critical approach, especially for young people coming through who are used to the most sophisticated forms of advertising that try to tap into the subliminal aspect of our being. How do we begin to teach young people to deconstruct that which has become so familiar to them? They get up in the morning, from that point on they are bombarded by images. How do they begin? How do we teach them to deconstruct this continual bombardment of images? Okay, so I think when we talk about the turn to the visual as an intellectual change, a kind of change of paradigm, I think really the five elements that I want to comment on here. First of all, I think everybody here, the rise of the concepts of visual culture and visual studies simultaneously that have occurred in the last couple of decades. Still quite very early on in this process. The way in which Mitchell has decided that he might define the concept of visual culture, the rise of notions of visual studies and of approaches to these two subjects that become subjects and disciplines in their own right. The rise of visualization research methodology. I know this is a topic that's very close to Jayne's heart. She's one that's been, in the journal as one of the co-editors who's going to be looking very closely at how we might encourage that question of a methodological interest in visualization and how it might contribute to our ongoing research agenda. Of course, there are essentially also a set of philosophical questions around the concepts of visualization that impact upon notions like representation, meaning, and culture. And in particular, we know the way in which the concept of representation has a sort of double edge to it, the political notion and the epistemological, and how they sometimes are conflated. The way in which we grew up with a kind of, under the influence of logical empiricism, where the relationship between the world and language was seen as a kind of a form of representation, a form of accurate representation. How does a sentence accurately represent the world? And Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle were very much influenced by that kind of what now loosely has come to be called logical empiricism or logical positivism. It's an epistemology that dominated the early part of the 20th century, and one that we're still recovering from in a way. So now we're talking about different kind of epistemologies around the notion of representation. So, not inexorably, but let me say, I think importantly, looking at the notion of the visual as a means of scientific communication. So we're at the forefront of this activity. As I say, this is actually the first journal in education, probably in the humanities, to take the question of the visual as a means of scientific communication seriously. And the major publishers, to get them to the point where they're prepared to experiment is, I think, a really important move. So now we're talking about the birth of the video journal. And in the original proposal that was put forward, actually it was in 2011, what we wanted to do was to really begin to initiate a new movement in education publishing. And I should say something about this form, I see that not all the names are represented here that you can see, up to 10 foundation members who are willing to contribute to this new video journal of education and pedagogy. It's online now. It's available now, and the first articles will be online by the end of July. I'm assured by spring. So with that, thank you very much. This is the end of my part of the lecture. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jayne White. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to pick up where Michael left off and to talk about more closely to the notions of pedagogy and visuality and visual culture in relation explicitly to the development of the thinking that as we've gone through so far, recognising that it's very early days in terms of our work. So neither, as everyone here will know, neither pedagogy nor video are new concepts in themselves. While we can trace pedagogy back well before even Greek antiquity, there is a reasonably long recent history, now both in educational research and practice, of us using video for educational and pedagogical purposes. I myself can trace back over 30 years ago as an infant teacher using video in a New Zealand Early Childhood Centre for assessment purposes. So in itself, for me, it's not new, but what is new is the trajectory that we're about to embark upon, which is very exciting. But until recently, I think it would be fair to say, certainly in my part of the world, that the use of video in education has largely oriented to our inability to conceptualise beyond the kinds of pedagogies that are heavily influenced by modes of transmission or mediation of knowledge between the video and individual consciousness. Thus, exploiting video as a pedagogical tool in context, certainly, as Michael's pointed out, beyond prominent text-based approaches, but also that follow learning or at best seek to understand how learning takes place. Harnessed within contemporary systems that promote narrow forms of engagement, production, location and use of video, each of these can be problematic in themselves because they're based on a universal kind of master pedagogy, typically located, dare I say it, in traditional classrooms. The potential for video to act as a protagonist in the field has until recently been constrained within education in a narrower sense than what we're hoping to pose for our work within the journal, thus inhibiting its potential to generate new insights and approaches and perhaps even new conceptualizations of pedagogy as a public and plural concept, as well as process in the production of knowledge, 21st century knowledge, and constructions of associated realities. So, in contemplating the broader field of visuality that Michael has already established for us, and in consideration of wider conceptions of pedagogy that currently exist, as well as those we cannot yet even imagine, we can exceed traditional notions of teaching and learning by expanding on the way video itself might be summoned to pedagogy, going beyond the why questions to ask how, what if, so what, as well as the infinite questions of and, that in the field that exceed master frames of reference. Likewise, we can exceed the limitations of vision to embrace visuality as a centralising pedagogical concept that is oriented to the relationships and connections between different kinds of knowledge, different ways of knowing and coming to know, bringing subjects such as media studies, film studies, into dialogue with traditional concepts of education, to give but one example. Here I want to draw a very careful distinction between vision and visuality that is so important for our orientation and future scholarship with video. As Elizabeth Kaczynski recently explained, vision is what is processed via the eye. When it's brought to bear on visuality, we're looking at a piecing together of interconnected relationships between what is seen and what can or could be imagined or thought or felt, as well as what cannot. By making this distinction, I want to highlight the limits of vision when used unquestionably as the received truth. And we see this in video which talks about anemic visibility or visual essentialism, to a greater expansion using the notion of visualization. So building on the provocations of video researchers who we probably all know, such as Sarah Pink and Dawn Monet, we want to argue for a kind of methodological enrichment in the way we might think about our work within the Video Journal of Education and Pedagogy as interconnected, collective, open and creative. These concepts expand on earlier philosophical discoveries concerning the image by people, as Michael's already mentioned, such as John Bergman in The Collapse of the Religiosity of Art, Baudrillard in The Simulacra, Debord in The Society of the Spectacle, to name but a few, heralding contemplations of visual practices such as the colonial project of the objectifying gaze, suggesting that creating distance between the self and the image is of vital importance, in doing so raising serious questions around the appearance of things that coincide with the beginnings of the end of modernism. Michael and I have retained a lingering interest in the constructivist shifts generated, for example, out of revolutionary Russian avant-garde movements in this regard, which sought to explore the relationship between visual and visuality well over 100 years ago. And in my recent visit to your Museum of Contemporary Art, I saw some very fine examples of this kind of thinking, arguing for a collective creativity where meaning is dialogically interpreted rather than merely received. Modern rhetoric exploits these concepts, summoning a kind of visual trickery to the table as a means of shifting consciousness. Conceptualized as visualization, however, I think we could all agree that all video is trickery and shifts to a dialogue about the way video alters the world and our experience from various standpoints, giving access to a creative engagement, and as such, reasserting a pedagogical emphasis towards modes of thinking that exceed their individual boundaries. So many of you will be familiar with this little clip that I just wanted to share with you. And I'll leave it running as I'm speaking. Oh, I didn't want the sound. Stop it. It's all right. I just wanted to give you the idea of a moving image, since we're talking about the moving image. But you know, it's all very well to talk about visuality in a general sense, but what does video specifically offer to this discussion? Well, while the philosophical history of the image offers a great deal to contemplate concerning the purity of the image and its meanings, we need to now also think about what can be additionally contemplated when the visual moves. We have this movement. We're told that the very first moving image was produced in 1878 using multiple still cameras and a Zoo Praxis scope. I've never seen one in real life, but it sounds very interesting. A device used for capturing movement through image, a bit like the old moving cards trick, and which predated techniques such as the celluloid that are still used today. It was Thomas Edison who came up with the concept of the moving or motion picture in 1889, and the rest, as they say, is history. Understandably, early emphasis on video was on the technical issues faced by the genesis of the moving image, and these continued to orient the field for many years to come as technologies were perfected, and we can see this in Deleuze's attention to the action image through the medium of motion. Now, for instance, who could forget the Beta versus VHS, or maybe I'm showing my age here, with VHS winning the day due to its affordability. The mere price, we're told, in the 1987 issue of the journal Video Maker, $2,186 US for a camcorder. 10 years later, they report mass growth in sales, decreases in costs, and celebrate the fact, get this, that even grandmas could edit video. So I'm really pleased about that, being a grandma myself. With this technology, the idea of capturing video gave way to its manipulated potential for seeing anew. So what I wanted to show you here, whether I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, is the IBM's movie, the 1977 movie, which I've kind of fast forwarded a bit here. Technology's it's not going to work. Okay, anyway. What you see here is what it portrays as 40 powers of 10 on a single perspective, theorising the systematic rendering of space through micro-connectivity. It was a post-war integration of military technologies and information theory and communication science. Now, through this moving manipulation, okay, we'll just do that. Through this moving manipulation of the visual, the self could now be conceptualised in a much broader way than had been previously imaginable. Suddenly one could be there virtually, in turn shaping new ways of seeing and being in the world through the moving image as a mode of thinking. Portraying the way vision can be manipulated through the moving image prompted a return to some of the earlier questions that had plagued visuality and posed a whole host of new questions beyond those that had already been developed, such as where to see, how to see, who to see with, who's behind the image, who am I next to, who do I imagine I'm with, and then of course invoking questions such as what else might be seen in the production, manipulation, modulation and consumption of video, giving rise to film methods such as Eisenstein's work, such as the montage that many of you will be familiar with here today. Essentially, once we added sound to video, we had another whole dimension that we could start to contemplate, giving further effect to these ideas and what could be seen, and essentially wrapping the visual within what was described as a sound shadow that offered multi-sensory, layered approaches to seeing as an embodied encounter, inviting renewed perspectives, as well as increasing the agentic potential for learners and their insights. Now an invitation to look at what might be created out of the visual experience, as well as the video itself, came to the fore. When located within the research, as it quickly was once researchers saw its potential, video offered increased possibilities for the generation of detailed data and new ways of both capturing and working with it, using things like participatory ethnography and observational approaches. And I think the field owes a great deal to people like Gillian Rose, Ian Haywood, Barry Sandywood, Gunther Kress, Theo van Leeuwen, I could go on, Goldman, Deary, to name a few, who have all in various ways made this point in their video-oriented research texts and projects, which I'm sure many here today are familiar with. Suffice to say that the divide between vision and visuality was now fully collapsed. Instead of essentialising a visual given or in understanding ourselves as spectators, we are now invited to reconcile the theory and practices of visualisation beyond vision, to engage with other sensory implications for how we understand the socio-cultural constructions of experience, giving rise to the multimodal use of video data alongside other forms of subjectivity, where we now see interviews collecting in the work of Joe Tobin's Preschool in Three Cultures, or David Clarke's cross-cultural video analysis, or in terms of what might be described as problem-based learning, which connects pedagogy. It's an interesting field, I think, and we have one paper in our journal issues to come out shortly, with connecting this idea with real work situations, using video triggers in tandem with compatible approaches. And I won't dwell on that for the purposes of time. But these and other video technologies also become highly manipulable and explicit, dissolving a host of other boundaries that exist between things like research and art, and I know that's very much at the heart of some people here today, research and science, with an explosion of exploration concerning new methods and approaches given the new technologies that we're developing at the same time and which continue to develop at a rapid rate. There are lots of examples of this in the contemporary video research for education. Many are offered in our current program that we're about to enjoy over the next 2 days. But of particular interest seems to be the emphasis placed on the various uses of video for emancipatory purposes and social justice agendas, for example, documentary, performance, industry-oriented analysis, drama ethnography, and the work of Margaret Sims, my colleague in Australia, and so on, and often located in multimodal contexts that create an amazing layering of ideas, each with a great deal of potential, I think, for us to imagine new ways of being with one another in the world, being challenged to rethink, reorient pedagogies in much broader ways than ever before, far beyond the classroom, or dare I say it, the academy. And as a consequence, exploring alternative epistemological and ontological domains that have previously been silenced in closed spaces such as these. So with these shifts, video pedagogy has also opened itself up to new kinds of associated philosophical inquiries, and this has been an orientation of my work in contemplation with the relationship between seeing and interpretation, providing new ways of engaging with video, speaking pedagogy, and interrogating the visualities that arise in the intersections. So with the moving image comes too the opportunity to collapse Cartesian divides, because the moving body, as well as the voice in its traditional sense, can be taken into serious account. It is both discoverable and interpretable by consumers as well as researchers, inviting open collaborative forms of inquiry and challenging previous assertions. Accessing bodily experience opens up potential to understand interactions and transform emotions through the process of constant recreation offered by video and the associated technologies. But those welding or perhaps now wearing the camera and those viewing the footage and its interpretations are as implicated as their subjects in this pedagogical project. We are well beyond the spectacle now and moving into a virtual world that connects human beings in previously unimagined ways through means such as social media and virtual realities, beyond commodity fetishism. A quick overview of the most recent video research in this year, for example, highlights the emphasis now being placed on the social nature of visualization. We can see some helpful concepts in this regard in the treatment of the notion of frictions, which I haven't got time to talk to you about, but we'll do that at the break if you like. But also to herald 2016 in the literature is now being heralded as the age of the virtual. And I think this is an important thing for us to be thinking about in terms of the work of the journal. So we're seeing this predominantly at the moment in the literature in terms of video gaming and virtual reality. Seeing both genres take into account the manipulation of moving image. In a recent review of its usage, we found that the benefits of virtual reality for psychology, medicine, vocational training, perspective taking, classroom work are all being thought about right as we speak. And I don't know if any of you have seen Michael Bodeker's recent TED Talk, where he shows how the next generation of scientists can be empowered by teachers who are willing to embrace these new ideas and new technologies and new ways of working with them. These advances, I want to really be clear that I'm not promoting them for their wow factor. It's about contemplating new forms of philosophical inquiry that speak in terms of the connectivity of video to the ever-increasing social and global networks that it locates. Thinking about the open society that Michael raised earlier challenges us further to think about not even only the use of video, but also a return to associated modes of thinking, subjectivity, and even the gaze itself. We must think beyond its immediate location, its possibilities, including its threats, and that's a whole other discussion for us to have, and its future, which almost now becomes central to pedagogy, and indeed is. Video must now be shared if it is to generate knowledge in these collective spaces. No longer can we be satisfied with researcher assurances that they have secretly seen, what they've secretly seen in their laboratories constitutes truth. As members of the scholarly community, we must demand to see what is being proposed and grant the opportunity to challenge accordingly, and support others to work discerningly with video and its varied manipulations. In this domain, we see the development of video labs, many of whom are represented at this conference, and others as virtual or remote labs, as very important for highlighting these ideas across distant virtual pedagogical spaces of the future. We need to search in these spaces and their connections to other spaces as a form of collective intelligence in a public pedagogy that was once located in classrooms but can now be thought of within recent social movements, not least within the consideration of big data and global openness, and as a means of sifting through the overwhelming present data glut which saturates our world to see the patterns of ideas in flow. Here there's much to think about in the ways we research, write and practice visuality, using video as a kind of pedagogical mashup, as Kieran Beard described. Pedagogical emphasis now lies in these spaces in between the teacher, the learner, the technology and the global community, who must all ask what forms of subjectivity are being created by collective engagement with the moving image and its manipulation. This exists not only in the researcher's computer or reported at conferences such as these in an institutionally sanctioned manner, but within the global world, for example, Facebook, which now has the means to make use of it in multiple and unimaginable ways, and unleashes video beyond the grasp of any individual or group to the hyperlinked collective, whose limits are boundless in consideration of the pedagogical agentiality of video. We can also start to think about its potential in terms of migrated meanings and created associations. So rather than the moving image and its influence on the individual learner as a primary agenda for visuality, we are now in an era where the moving image exists well beyond the individual knowledge and even, perhaps, dare I say it, consent. And this has created new ways of doing things for us all, arguably even heralding a new way of waging war. As my colleague at University of Waikato, Alex Gillespie, asserts, the war of terrorism has at least been partially constructed using video on social network. However, we must also think about the very genesis of meaning and its emotional power, not just as propaganda, but as creating the very situation, the methodological imperative to our work, and the importance of recognising visuality and its relationship to pedagogy in a much broader sense today. So returning to our inheritance from philosophies of the image, we want to argue the importance of revising our understandings concerning truth claims in the ways they might be put to use, or some might say exploited, pedagogically in the creation of knowledge and what could or should, as a consequence, be taught or learned. To think about revising our concepts and our practices, and understanding that we are now a panopticon of the many, not the few. And as such, we can no longer keep video as discrete data that is presented without pedagogical question. For this to have its fullest impact, we are called to account as the collective we in a connected pedagogical space that is bound up within the knowledge economy and the networked society. Virtual spaces that are shared with video production and visualisation. Perhaps this is our greatest pedagogical challenge going forward. So, in conclusion, we've tried to raise some critical, theoretical, practical, ethical considerations for the future of the journal by looking back and looking forward, and thinking about its relationship to pedagogy and what we now might mean and in the future could mean when we talk about pedagogy in a 21st century open society, drawing from philosophical legacy of visuality that we hope will be explored during the conference and in the future of the journal we launch tonight. In consideration of interconnected visualities and identities in a digitalised global world, we can think about the extent to which any of us, or any pedagogical movement for that matter, is ever out of view, and whether they ought to be if we are serious about making our work visible. We can also think about the extent to which video is ever about an individual encounter with video, and perhaps herald an era that exceeds notions of things like identity as some sort of fixed state or formation to embrace the open. Pedagogically, we might therefore move towards a kind of visuality that recognises us as effortless visualisers, Jeff Melvin tells us. In doing so, we are all invited to legitimise uncertainty, multiple perspectives, and by association, a space where creativity, indeed, might be revisioned. At the same time, the collective we are not merely those who sit behind the camera. We, the collective, need to generate and innovate pedagogies that will assist us in reflexively navigating the received virtual and real visual spaces that now wholeheartedly inhabit our lives, perhaps even construct them. It is to these complex, open spaces that we invite scholarly video and text, one or the other, or a combination of both, in the journal, and of course in the discussions that orient the days ahead, and also, importantly, the work of the Visual Pedagogies Association. And we want to thank Peter and Milan for bringing this together and making it possible for us to begin this very important dialogue. Thank you.